at the unsettled intersections of race and queer and post-colonial and feminist critical technoscience studies. Collaborative and collective thinking, especially in something like real time and shared space, is a somewhat rare practice for some of us, maybe many of us. And I've been doing quite a bit of it here in Southern California this last week. It makes me hungry for more. It's a particular pleasure for me to have Sharon Trawick in the room. She's someone who introduced me early on to the sustained pleasures and possibilities of thinking with others in sustained collaborative scenes, so that's a public shout out to you. The set of papers I will think with are in the third section of this fabulous issue of Scholar and Feminist Online on governmentality and activism in biotechnical times. Let me give you a selected sketch of the sites that these essays cross through. First, post-conflict Guatemala, where 3 of the essays actually touch down. Where Diane Nelson looks at mountains that are no longer there, not only enclosed by a new round of capitalist accumulation called mountaintop mining, but destroyed. Where Lindsay Smith stands with forensic scientists building a DNA data bank out of the human remains of, and bones and teeth, of some of the 200,000 Guatemalans massacred during the Civil War. And where Laura Briggs narrates the transnational adoption of Guatemalan children as arguably a new form of disappearance in Guatemala, conjured out of a US imperialist imaginary of rescue and practices of reproductive governance that figures adoption as an individualized solution to the structural violence of neoliberal regimes of enforced dispossession. Then, with a focus on the United States, Anna Ward analyzes how fat mobilizes fears around living and dying, while obesogenic accounts of obesity re-signify fat bodies and populations with racial and class markers of pathologized indifference and improper desires for hyperconsumption. And finally, with a transnational and explicit transnational gaze, Melinda Cooper tracks the philanthropic biopolitics of an experimental humanitarianism in which at-risk populations for infectious disease, like sex workers in Cambodia and elsewhere, become a targeted labor force as experimental subjects for biomedical prevention trials, whose labor value is precisely their vulnerability to risks exacerbated by neoliberal withdrawal of harm reduction and prevention programs in increasingly triaged and devastated public health programs. In sum, just another day in the empirical and theoretical fields of critical, queer, race, post-colonial, and feminist technoscience studies. My sister-in-law, who works for the Gates Foundation, one of the principal actors in the experimental humanitarianism Melinda Cooper makes visible, once listened to me riff for a few minutes, it really was just a few minutes, on the Gates Foundation and a US history of militarized philanthropic humanitarianism dating at least back to Rockefeller. And she said to me, honestly, how do you sleep at night? To which I responded to her, honestly, how do you sleep at night? And in that rupture between her and my recognition and misrecognition of the other's everyday worlds, decades of feminist practice has danced, looking for bridges that might be less violent than the rupture itself. And the truth is, I didn't sleep that well last night. And today, exhausted, a bit past my own bio-psychophysiological limits, which still haven't learned, who has, to respect with the sustaining practice of what we now call self-care. Today I want to tell you, and I was trying not to, that I read the set of 5 papers as reports from a poorly archived network of distributed catastrophe, with a wry, sad smile toward Michelle and her patient important work on distributed reproduction. Today, taking seriously the invitation from Rachel to also, as discussant, talk about our own work, I speak to you from the research field, not entirely chosen, of slow disaster, distributed catastrophe, failure, extinction, exhaustion, as I try to pull my own intellectual politics and practices away from the somewhat horrifying, somewhat fascinating focus on the disaster event, to talk instead, or together, about the ordinary accumulating repetitious catastrophe of human and non-human worlds, wearing thin, of ordinary time itself growing exhausted. You can call it climate change, environmental crisis, ecological implosion, planet damage, but what interests me most is how catastrophe, uneven and dispersed, can assemble slowly out of ordinary technosocial acts of production, disposal, accumulation, replacement, repeat. I'm interested in staring at the horrifying, fascinating catastrophe of the underwater blowout of BP's oil well on the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico in 2010, live streamed to millions of viewers through the digital visuality of the remotely operated vehicles that built and then tried to destroy the failed well, so that we could watch the millennial time of petroleum matter explode into the present, deep time, spreading with a relentless geologic through the startled waters. I'm interested in staring at that disaster event and then moving my attention slowly, repeatedly, to the plastic bags wrapped in the trees, the manufactured strings of polymerized molecular chains of petromatter, deep time hanging, numinous, shredded from the branches, as the plasticity of time itself is wasted slowly in a culture's fierce oblivion to its own accumulation of garbage. I'm interested in that move and my methods, which I call occasionally collage poetics or magical sub-realism or performance theory, and they're operating right now, though in somewhat exhausted form. So, the distributed catastrophe I see in the 5 essays on governmentality and activism are of course interrupted by the complexities, ethnographic and historical specificities of the story each author tells. Diane narrates of the lively biotechnology of the consulta, the votes that are organized and counted, sometimes with a 100% consensus, against the mining activity, as the surplus life promised by the mining companies is countered by a response-able refusal of the infrastructural violence of life limited by death, damage, and disappearance enacted by the mining companies in the name of development. And Lindsay traces how the dead return as forensic kin, ritually reanimated by DNA testing that leans on and builds family-based human rights activism and a scientifically enhanced physical and political care of the dead. Reports from the queer post-colonial race and feminist technoscientific fields are complicated, not all slow catastrophe all of the time. But I want to press on the problem, and maybe partly because I just came from science and technology meetings in San Diego, where really they were saturated with panels on disaster and catastrophe and environmental crisis. So I want to press on the problem of the accumulating disaster of what I want to call the necro effects of biopolitics, and perhaps of our biotechnical era, and perhaps of our biosciences, as we, an unevenly and unequally distributed we, try to reckon with the slow disaster of techno and scientific and industrial and post-industrial capitalism, to reckon with the failures of modernity that now accumulate as material and imaginary toxic waste, with half-lives longer than all of our lives in this room, put together and multiplied by 30,000. I am not talking about necropolitics, the strategic massified deployment of death and the risk of death that Akil Mbembe and others have used to correct and redirect Foucault's insights. I'm not talking about the state racisms that Foucault theorizes as the political rationale of the biopolitical state for killing its own and its others. I'm trying to name the accidental geno and ethnocides, the unintended death and dying and damage accumulating out of biopolitical regimes of expansive management of human and non-human bios, out of the technoscientific pursuit of the optimization and administration of human and non-human life in the name of security, economy, well-being, good governance. I'm trying to name not the making live and letting die that we have learned how to look for, but for the trying to make live and fucking up and killing and destroying that we live in and die in every day. I'm thinking about what Joe Masco calls the fallout practices, not only of nuclear militarism, but of industrialization and capitalism and the industrializations that aren't all about capitalism. The long arc of temporally and spatially dispersed effects of irradiated death worlds. I'm thinking about chemical latency, which Michelle in this issue conceptualizes out of the archival sludge of petrocapitalism in Chemical Valley, as it blooms in unanticipated forms, like the queer round goby, and as it interrupts and damages reproductive economies within and across species. I'm thinking about colony collapse of the modern industrialized bee, which Jay Kosek locates in Homo aping ecologies of metaphoric and material kinship, and his story about how all beekeepers today can do to counter the mysterious and mass death and disappearance of the bee is to speed up their industrialized reproduction. I'm thinking then about the politics of failure, failure of infrastructures, failures like species extinction, failure of biosecurity unevenly, but also really dispersed at multiple levels. Don't eat unidentified chicken right now in California, I learned from eating ricana. The catastrophe of the present. In my incantation of failures, I'm also thinking about the failure of our categories of thought to meet the catastrophes of the present. In a moment of neoliberal biopolitics, where arguably the two most important biopolitically organized populations are winners and losers. Let us think with and as losers to see where it might lead in terms of conceptual methods and political and feminist imaginations. And let me then just, in the interest of discussion, give a brief coda on methods. If technoscience is and produces methods, then I would like us to think today how our methods, including our conceptual methods, as cultural storytellers, as archivists, as ethnographers, as critical theorists, are also being transformed by technoscience. Feminism, bioscience, race are domains of critical inquiry and sites of methodological innovation. I'm thinking here especially of questions about the way that digital technologies, which are biotechnologies in an important sense, are transforming our research practices, for some of us very rapidly. I'm thinking about the digital display and circulation of the Scholar and Feminist online and this particular issue, as well as the research practices that went into composing those essays. So I hope that we might talk about some of those techno-scientific infrastructures today as we are our live stream.
No, we're not live stream.
Okay, that's fine.
Not live.
Thank you.